Today, we're diving into one of the biggest intellectual showdowns of the 20th century. Seriously. It's a clash of ideas that was kicked off by a massive global crisis, and it completely changed how we think about the economy, what the government should do, and really our own financial lives. This is the story of Keynes versus the classics. So let's just get right to the heart of it. Picture this. The economy is in a free fall. Businesses are shutting down, people are losing their jobs left and right. What do? Do you step in and try to fix it? Or do you trust the system to sort itself out on its own? Your answer to that one question, well, it puts you right in the middle of a debate that has shaped economics for almost 100 years. Okay, so to really get what a big deal Keynes was, you first have to understand the world before him. Before the 1930s, there was basically one main way of thinking about the economy. It was this vision of perfect balance and a deep, almost religious faith in the power of the market. This was the classical view. The core belief of classical economics was pretty simple. The market is like a finely tuned, self-regulating machine. Sure, it might get hit by a shock and stumble for a bit, but it would never completely break down. And why not? Because they believed prices and wages were totally flexible. If nobody's buying stuff, prices will just fall until they do. If people are out of work, wages will drop until companies can afford to hire them again. In this world, long-term mass unemployment wasn't just unlikely, it was basically impossible. And the foundation for this whole way of thinking was a really powerful idea called Say's law. Basically, it says that the very act of making things, of supplying goods, automatically creates the income needed to buy those goods. In other words, supply creates its own demand. It all fits together in a perfect little circle. Sounds a bit too good to be true, doesn't it? And this is a great breakdown of that logic. On the left, you've got the classical argument. I make something, I get paid. I use that money to buy something you made. It's a closed loop, right? Everything that's produced gets bought. But on the right, you see the massive flaw that Keynes just blew wide open. What happens if I get paid and decide to save some of that money instead of spending it? The classicals said, oh, no problem. Someone will borrow your savings and invest it. But Keynes asked the killer question, but what if they don't? What if people are scared and just hoard cash, and businesses are too pessimistic to invest? Well, all of a sudden, that perfect loop is broken. And in this classical world, money itself wasn't a huge deal. It was just a convenience, kind of like a veil that just made transactions easier. Its role was summed up by this famous equation, MV equals PY. Now, don't worry, it's simpler than it looks. It just says that the amount of money in the system times how fast it's being spent equals the overall price level times the economy's real output. The classicals figured that V and Y, how fast money moves and how much stuff we make, were pretty stable. So if you just print more money, the only thing that really changes is P, the price level. In short, printing money just causes inflation, not real growth. Money was neutral.
And then reality hit, like a freight train. The neat, tidy, self-correcting machine of classical theory ran headfirst into something it just could not handle, the Great Depression. This wasn't some small bump in the road. This was a total system meltdown that blew that entire worldview to pieces. The old theory said the economy would bounce right back, but the reality was this number. In the US, unemployment hit an unbelievable 25%. 1 out of every 4 people who wanted a job couldn't find one. This was the moment that proved the classical model wasn't just a little off, it was catastrophically wrong in the real world. The so-called self-correcting machine had completely seized up. And this wasn't just an American story. It spread across the globe like a virus. World trade just collapsed, falling by almost 2/3. All these countries that were linked together were now dragging each other down into the same black hole. The crisis was global, and it was deep. You know, the stakes here could not have been higher. This quote from Robert Mundell is absolutely chilling. He argues that the terrible policy mistakes of that time, which were based on these old classical ideas, didn't just cause a bad recession. They literally created the fertile ground for political extremism and ultimately a world war. This wasn't just some academic squabble. This was about the fate of civilization. It was right out of the ashes of this disaster that a new challenger stepped into the ring, an intellectual giant named John Maynard Keynes. He looked at all the devastation around him and said, you know what? The old theories are not just wrong, they are dangerously wrong. It was time for a revolution in thinking. In 1936, Keynes dropped his bombshell of a book, The General Theory, and its message was a full frontal assault on everything that came before. He argued that economies aren't like a kid's toy that always bounces back.
No, they can get stuck, really stuck, in a terrible state with high unemployment for years on end. The system was, in fact, broken. For Keynes, the big revolutionary shift was to stop focusing so much on supply and start focusing on demand. He came up with this idea of aggregate demand, which is just a fancy term for the total amount of spending in the entire economy. This, he said, was the real engine. If people are too scared to spend and businesses are too scared to invest, then that engine is going to sputter and stall out, and it doesn't matter how much stuff the economy could be producing. And this is where we get to his most powerful idea for a fix, the multiplier effect. If the private sector engine has stalled, Keynes said the government needs to give it a jump start. And check out how this works. When the government spends money, say $100, that's not where the story ends. That $100 becomes income for a worker. She then spends some of it, which becomes income for a store owner. The store owner spends some of that, and on it goes. That one initial injection of cash ripples through the whole economy, creating a much bigger bang for the buck. The formula here, 1 divided by 1 minus c, just shows you the math. That little c is just the fraction of any new income people tend to spend. The more they spend, the bigger the ripple effect. All right, so let's put these two views right next to each other, a real head-to-head comparison, so you can see just how night and day different they really are. This is the main event. At the most basic level, Keynes just flipped the whole thing on its head. The classicals said, if you build it, they will come. Production comes first. Keynes came along and said, nope, you've got it backwards. Businesses will only build things and hire people if they think someone's actually going to show up and buy it. Demand comes first. Demand creates its own supply. And on unemployment, again, polar opposites. The classicals kind of saw unemployment as a choice. People just weren't willing to work for a lower wage. Keynes thought that was just ridiculous. First of all, in the real world, wages are sticky. They don't fall that easily. And second, even if you could magically cut everyone's pay, it would be a complete disaster. You'd be sucking all the spending money out of the economy and making the whole situation even worse. And of course, all this leads to the ultimate disagreement. What should the government do? For the classicals, the answer was easy. Nothing. Get out of the way. Laissez-faire. Let the market do its thing. For Keynes, that was just abandoning your post in a crisis. He argued that when the private sector freezes up, the government is the only one big enough to step in, start spending, and break that vicious cycle. It had to be an activist. So Keynes pretty much won the argument, for a while at least. But this war of ideas never really ended. His revolution absolutely dominated policy for decades. But that old classical view, it never totally went away. It was just waiting for a chance to come back, in new forms, to challenge the Keynesian world. I mean, Keynes's legacy is just huge. His thinking shaped that whole prosperous post-war era, and he basically invented the field of macroeconomics as we know it. But then the 1970s hit with a whole new set of problems, and suddenly a classical revival started pushing back hard. And ever since then, every single time there's a crisis, this exact same debate just comes roaring back to life. Should we step in, or should we step back? And who is the leader of that revival? Well, according to the man who literally wrote the definitive biography of Keynes, Robert Skidelsky, it was one person, Milton Friedman. Friedman became the new champion for a generation that was ready to put its faith back in the markets. But, well, that's a whole other story for another day. And that brings us right back to that fundamental question we started with. This clash between Keynes and the classics isn't just some dusty old chapter in a textbook. It's a live debate. It's happening right now. It shapes our politics, our elections, and how we respond to every single economic challenge we face. So the next time a crisis hits and you hear people arguing about what to do, listen closely. You'll hear the echoes of this great debate, a debate that is very, very far from over.